Welcome back to Higher Change. We're going to talk about the chemistry of happiness, specifically the biology of our brain and how our brain affects our mental health and psychology. And today I am here with a friend, Dr. Sam Perez, who is a professor here at Washington Adventist University in life sciences. And he has a PhD in physiology and neuroimmunology. Sorry. How did you get into this? What really fascinated you or motivated you to study this?
My interest was mostly athletics. I was quite good. I was good in certain fields, I would say math. But science was not my forte. Science was an idea, something that, it'd be nice, it'd be cool to do that, be able to do science at a professional level. But once I began, I never stopped. And just by building on top of what I had, my training in the undergrad as a biochem major, and then taking on the life sciences, the hardcore life sciences such as molecular genetics, molecular biology, and then the physiology, and then physiology of the brain, and that order, I began to notice that, this is not so bad. I think I want to make a career of this.
I've heard it said that the brain consumes a lot of calories too. One thing I didn't know until I started studying is I always feel hungry when I'm studying. Is there any truth in that?
Yes, and that's a good and fortunately people that study that are students get just as hungry of somebody who's working for a competition, lifting weights or an athletic event, because our brain consumes a lot of calories. I mean, this 20% of the of the fuel that we consume goes to the brain is amazing. And even when we're studying and trying to learn, that's a lot of resources that the brain needs, calorically speaking.
We're going to look at some of the details about like I said, the different structure of the brain, and as well as the purpose and the function of the different parts of the brain. And so we're going to go into that next, and that's the goal of the lesson for today. The main point of this lesson today is that understanding how the brain and the nervous system worked helps us to better understand how our physical health and diet impact our mental health. So in this lesson, you will identify the parts of the neurons and nerves. You'll describe how neurons communicate. You'll identify divisions of the nervous system. You'll identify structures of the brain. You'll describe the impact of the endocrine system on mental health. And lastly, you'll describe the impact of our digestive system on our mental health. Let's start with the nervous system. An extensive network of specialized cells that carry information to and from all parts of the body is called the nervous system. Here's a picture of the nervous system in a body's exhibit. The nerves are all extracted from a body and put on display. The basic building block of the nervous system is the neuron. Here's a picture of the neuron. As you can see, it's basically a cell. Each neuron is like a cell. And so let's talk about the structure of this neuron, the basic building block of the nervous system. The cell that makes up the nervous system and which receives and sends messages within that system is called a neuron. Here's a diagram of what a neuron looks like. The long tube-like structure that carries the neural message to other cells on the neuron is called the axon. On a neuron, the branch-like structures that receive messages from other neurons is the dendrite. And lastly, the cell body of the neuron, responsible for maintaining the life of the cell and contains a mitochondria, is the soma. Let's take a closer look at this. So as you can see, there's a soma, which contains the nucleus, and then there's dendrites, which connect to other neurons, and then the long thing in the middle is the axon, and at the end of it is the axon terminals, which receive information from other neurons. Here's another view. This is a typical neuron, and as you can see, there's a cell body or the soma, and in the middle of it is the nucleus, and there's dendrites that extend outward, and these connect to other neurons, their axon terminals. And you can see the axon has some cells in it, and it's covered by a myelin sheath, and that helps speed up the transmission, which we'll talk about in a minute. The fatty substances produced by certain glial cells. Glial cells are cells that attach to the neuron. These substances that coat the axons and neurons to insulate, protect, and speed up conduction of the neural impulse is the myelin, or the myelin sheath. Myelin sheath is that protective coating. The bundles of axons in the body that travel together through the body are known as the nerves. And it's interesting because a neuron can be really large as it makes up the nerves. So how do they communicate with each other? Well, first of all, we have to understand how they can generate a neural impulse. Here's a picture of neurons as they generate their impulses. The charged particles located inside and outside of the neuron are called ions. The state of the neuron when not firing a neural impulse is known as the resting potential. At rest, the neuron is negatively charged inside and positively charged outside. When a neuron is stimulated, the charge reverses. This is the action potential or a nerve impulse. Neurons fire in an all or nothing manner. Here is a picture, a diagram that illustrates the action potential. So as an action potential nerve impulse travels down an axon, there is a change in the polarity across the membrane of the axon. In response to a signal from another neuron, sodium and potassium gated ion channels open and close as the membrane reaches its threshold potential. The sodium channels open at the beginning of the action potential, and sodium moves into the axon, causing depolarization. Repolarization occurs when the potassium channels open and moves out of the axon, creating a change in polarity between the outside of the cell and the inside. The impulse then travels down the axon in one direction only to the axon terminal, where it signals other neurons. So it's basically a chain. If you think about it like a chain, these are the links in the chain. And as you see in the diagram, the charge passes as the positive and negative ions flip, as a change in polarity between the outside and inside of this cell. And so then the impulse travels down the axon. It's an all or nothing motion. So how do they communicate? So it sends a charge, but then what? Well, at the end, there is a synapse. The synapse is the gap between the neurons. So as you can see in the end of that, right there at the end of the neuron, there's synaptic vesicles. And these are sac-like structures that are found inside the synaptic knob. The synaptic knob is that end where you can see it's at the end of the dendrite. And so it's the synaptic knob contains these vesicles, which contain chemicals. What are these chemicals? The neurotransmitters are chemicals that are found in the synaptic vesicles, which when released has an effect on the next cell. And these are released into the synapse, into that gap. So it goes into this gap where all these neurotransmitters float around. And these molecules fit into the receptor sites on the other cell and may be either excitatory or inhibitory. So molecules can excite or inhibit an impulse for the other cell. The excitatory neurotransmitter causes the receiving cell to fire, essentially. So what are these neurotransmitters? Some important neurotransmitters, and I'm going to slaughter the pronunciation, but let's try this. It's acetylcholine, ACH, activates muscles. And ACH is a very important neurotransmitter in muscle activation. Then there's GABA. It's an acronym. I'm not going to get into it now, but it's an amino acid that reduces excitability. And so it's opposite of activating muscles. It reduces excitability. Then there's the serotonin, which contributes to feelings of well-being and happiness. So if you don't have this, then you're not going to feel too happy. And then there is dopamine. Dopamine is, so if you think serotonin is the happiness neurotransmitter, dopamine is the pleasure chemical. It produces feelings of pleasure and rewards and motivates behavior. Then there's endorphin. Endorphin is both a hormone and a neurotransmitter and is a naturally occurring morphine or opioid that reduces pain and produces euphoria. Exercise can help relieve this. So when people are in pain, endorphins actually help people to not feel their pain. It produces euphoria. So exercise can help people feel good. Then there is norepinephrine or noradrenaline. Norepinephrine is both a hormone and neurotransmitter and is responsible for arousal and alertness and helps mobilize the body for action as it is involved in the fight or flight response. So that is involved in arousal and alertness. So that's an important one too. And the last one is oxytocin. And there's other neurotransmitters, but these are the most important ones I want you to know. Oxytocin is known as the cuddle hormone, and it's responsible for feelings of love and attachment bonding. So most neurotransmitters are taken back into the synaptic vesicles. That's where they came from. This is known as reuptake. So there are some drugs called like SSRIs that help with depression. Those are known as selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. What that does, it prevents the reuptake of these neurotransmitters just to ensure that there's a lot more of it floating around. So if you're not getting enough serotonin, which causes you to depress, then inhibiting the reuptake would ensure that you have more of it available. And that's why people take that to help them with depression. An agonist is a chemical substance that mimics or enhances the effects of a neurotransmitter on the receptor sites of the next cell, increasing or decreasing the activity of that cell. So like a drug, for example, that enhances the feeling of dopamine or makes you feel like you've got it, or gives you the feelings of endorphin, like in morphine, that would be an agonist because it mimics or enhances the effects of the neurotransmitter. The opposite kind of this chemical would be an antagonist. So let's talk about, now we understand how the neurotransmitters work in communicating between neurons, but let's look at it from a larger perspective and understand the divisions of the nervous system. So we just needed to know what the basic building blocks of the nervous system were, but now we can look at the bigger picture. So at the top of this hierarchy or of this division of the nervous system is obviously the nervous system. That's the overall organ system involving nerves. And the nervous system can be divided into two divisions. There's the peripheral nervous system and the central nervous system. As you can see, peripheral nervous system is, the central nervous system is the brain and the spinal cord, and that's considered the center of the nervous system, the central nervous system. And anything outside of those would be considered the peripheral nervous system. So anything that extends beyond the spinal cord, like into the arms and legs, those would be part of the peripheral nervous system. Now, the central nervous system, as I mentioned, is composed of the brain and the spinal cord. That's on the right. And then on the left, we see the peripheral nervous system is divided into the autonomic nervous system and the somatic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system is responsible for involuntary functions that are life-sustaining, such as your heart or your breathing and your digestive system. Then there is the somatic nervous system. These are the voluntary functions, which we're going to look at. And then in the autonomic nervous system, as I mentioned, those are the involuntary functions. This can be divided into the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. We'll talk about each of these. So if you're following along in a workbook, you may want to copy this diagram down so you can get some of the wording or the language. As you can see, it's the same diagram, just a little easier to read if you're writing it down. Again, at the top of the divisions is the nervous system, which divides into the peripheral nervous system and then the central nervous system. Okay, and if you need to, you can pause here and then proceed on. So let's start with the central nervous system. As we mentioned, the nervous system is composed of the peripheral central nervous system. We're going to focus on the central nervous system first. The main component of the central nervous system is the brain. That's the most important part of the whole nervous system. So the brain obviously is composed, it sits on top of the spinal cord and is the master controller of the entire nervous system and the entire body if you think about it. The main component of the central nervous system is the brain, and the spinal cord is a long bundle of neurons that carries messages to and from the body to the brain that is responsible for very fast, life-saving reflexes. So it allows you to have immediate responses right where it's needed. Let's look at some of the structures of the brain. Here's a video that demonstrates or shows all the different vast structures of the brain. It's very complex and intricate. As you can see in the background, there's some scans, cross-sectional scans of the brain, as you can see, and there's parts of it that you can't see that on the inside as well as on the outside, and so we're going to look at the intricate design of the brain. So the nervous system is composed of the central nervous system, which is made up of the brain and the spinal cord. And the brain is further subdivided into the forebrain, the midbrain, and the hindbrain. Let's talk about each of these sections of the brain. As you can see in this diagram, this illustrates where the midbrain, forebrain, and hindbrain are. The hindbrain is on the lower right side of this cross section of the brain, and this is where the cerebellum is, and it's in the lower back base of the brain. Then there's the forebrain, which is where the cortex is the top outermost part of the brain, and then in the middle of it is the midbrain, and that contains very important functions as well. We're going to talk about each of these components. Let's start with the hindbrain first. So the hindbrain is composed of these areas in the bottom right of this diagram, and we're going to look at each of those. The larger swelling above the medulla is the stem that attaches to the spinal cord, and the large swelling above the medulla that connects the top of the brain to the bottom, and that plays a part in sleep, dreaming, left-right body coordination, and arousal, is called the pons. It is involved in sleeping, waking, and dreaming. The medulla, right below that, or attached to it, regulates breathing and heart rate, automatic functions, which are involuntary, and all of these are necessary for life. So the medulla is very important as it operates life-sustaining functions. So here's a diagram that illustrates where the cerebellum, medulla, and pons are. As you can see, the cerebellum is in the back and it wraps around the medulla, and then at the top of the medulla is the pons. It's this larger swelling there. The reticular formation is an area of neurons that runs through the middle of the medulla and the pons, and slightly beyond, that is responsible for selective attention. It is responsible for arousal, alertness, and wakefulness. So the state of consciousness you're in, whether you're awake or you're sleeping, is controlled by the reticular formation. The part of the lower brain located behind the pons that controls and coordinates involuntary rapid fine motor movement is called the cerebellum. And so again, this controls involuntary rapid fine motor movement. So people oftentimes confuse the cerebrum and the cerebellum because they're spelled similarly, but they're very different. The cerebrum is in the front of the brain, and that performs higher functions like interpreting touch, vision, and hearing, as well as speech. And it's involved in reasoning, emotions, learning, and fine control of movement. The cerebellum, on the other hand, coordinates muscle movements, and especially those that are more automatic, and maintains your posture and balance, things that you don't typically have to think about. So here's a picture that illustrates the cerebellum, as you can see in the back. So the structures under the cortex, let's talk about that next. That's what makes up the midbrain. The limbic system is in the midbrain, and this is the more primitive side of the brain that is responsible for emotions, memory, and learning. Here's a three-dimensional image that is rotating. As you can see, it illustrates the different components of the midbrain. And as we've seen before, we saw the at the bottom, of course, is the medulla and the pons, but above that, you can see those structures in color that are highlighted to illustrate where the midbrain is at. So the part of the limbic system that is located in the center of the brain, this structure relays sensory information from the lower part of the brain to the proper areas of the cortex and processes some sensory information before sending it to the proper area. And this is called the thalamus. You can see that is the one highlighted in red. So the thalamus directs incoming sensory messages to the higher centers. So again, this is in the center of the brain, and it relays sensory information from the lower part of the brain to the proper areas of the cortex, the higher forebrain. And it processes some sensory information before sending it. So that is the thalamus. The hypothalamus, it sits underneath the thalamus. So if you think hippo, as in hippopotamus, that is something that goes underwater, right? So hippo literally means under. So the hypothalamus is under the thalamus. And it's considered the master switchboard as it coordinates between the pituitary master gland and the autonomic nervous system. So thus it's associated with homeostasis. Remember, hypothalamus, homeostasis. That's important. So the hypothalamus coordinates our basic drives such as hunger, thirst, emotion, our desire for sex, things like that. And that's because the hypothalamus helps regulate internal body states. Like, if you get hungry, that's because there's something that's off. And so the hypothalamus is involved in getting your brain activated to fulfill your basic needs. And so that's what it does. And that's homeostasis basically means a balance. So if you're hungry or thirsty, it's going to seek balance. And that's what the hypothalamus does. The hippocampus is the gateway to memory that enables us to form new memories. And as you can see, that is in the diagram, the one that's highlighted, and it looks like two curvy structures, one curvy structure on each side of the brain. So it is a curved structure located within each temporal lobe, responsible for the formation of long-term memories and the storage of memory for the location of objects. So this is responsible for memories. Hippocampus is responsible for memories. Remember that. The amygdala is a roughly almond-shaped mass of gray matter inside each cerebral hemisphere near the hippocampus. If you remember this, amygdala is a word that sounds like almond. In fact, it comes from that word. So amygdala, almond. It's an almond-shaped structure. And it's in each cerebral hemisphere near the hippocampus. And the amygdala is a very important structure that we need to know in psychology because it's involved with the experiencing of emotions. It evaluates sensory information to determine its importance. It's where the fight or flight response begins and is responsible for the memory of fear. So if a bear comes at you, you're either going to fight or flight, run. And that's the amygdala is responsible for the fight or flight response. So in the limbic system, we have what is called a reward circuit. Of course, there are several neurotransmitters involved in the emotional system, but I want to look at this specific pathway because it's a very important one to human behavior as it's involved in motivation and addiction and things like that. So this is called the dopamine-based reward circuit, otherwise known as the mesolimbic pathway. And it's called mesolimbic simply because it's in the middle of the limbic system. And it's the dopamine-based reward circuit because it involves the neurotransmitter dopamine. And remember, what is dopamine? What kind of neurotransmitter is that? What is it responsible for? It's responsible for pleasure. So that's why this is involved in addiction and things like that. It's about how our brain experiences pleasure. And so there's a reward circuit. That's why it's called reward circuit, because it helps the brain feel rewarded by that sense of pleasure. So when this circuit is triggered by a pleasurable stimulus, so pleasurable stimulus such as food, water, sex, attachment with another human, whether it releases some kind of pleasurable stimulus, this triggers the reward circuit. So things like food, water, sex all activate the VTA, and the VTA is the ventral tegmental area. VTA, as you can see in the diagram, this is right in the middle of the limbic system near the midbrain. So the VTA is where dopamine is produced, and the dopamine is released, which sends a signal through the reward circuit. So here's a picture of the neurotransmitter dopamine being released into that synaptic gap. Okay, so remember we looked at a diagram that was similar to this. The neurotransmitters come from those sacs or those messenger containers, as we call it, that they're essentially the synaptic vesicles. Synaptic vesicles are what contain these neurotransmitters. And the neurotransmitter is released into the synaptic gap, and they're then picked up by matching receptor sites. And the receptor sites are specific for the neurotransmitter. And so dopamine is then released and it's captured by the receptor sites. So the dopamine, it sends a signal essentially to the nucleus accumbens, and the NA, the nucleus accumbens, then sends a message to the prefrontal cortex, where the learned reward is then stored in memory. So when we do experience pleasure, our brain remembers where we last experienced it, so that we can re-experience the pleasurable thing again. And so our body knows we know where to experience that pleasure again. It's interesting because what differentiates a normal pleasure seeking from addiction is that typically when you experience the pleasure, it is rewarding, right? But with an addiction, it has a diminishing reward. So the reward basically diminishes. So in addiction, people find that the seeking of pleasure is actually more rewarding than the actual act itself. So people have come to associate the actions of looking for the pleasure with the actual pleasure itself. But when they receive that, then the dopamine release isn't very strong. And so then they don't feel like they really got their need met. And so then they go out looking for that pleasure again. And then they again don't, and it's exciting looking for the pleasure, but when they get it, it doesn't really satisfy. So addiction is truly just not very satisfying. So here's a close-up of the reward circuit. As you can see, the VTA, ventral tegmental area, sends a message to the nucleus accumbens, which then stores information in the prefrontal cortex. So that brings us to the cortex, which is the where the forebrain is. So cerebral cortex regions contribute to different aspects of emotion and cognition. This is where our higher level thinking occurs. The cerebral cortex is the outermost layer of the brain's cerebrum. So if you think about cerebrum is the outer part, the top part of the brain, but the cortex is the outermost layer of the brain's cerebrum. And it consists of densely packed neurons, which are responsible for higher thought processes and interpretation of sensory input. So, like I said, it's responsible for higher thinking as well as interpreting your senses. This brief clip illustrates half of the cortex known as a hemisphere, as you can see as it spins around. And so this is the outer cortex, and this is where higher thought processes take place. The cortex is divided into two hemispheres. The right hemisphere is in charge of the left side of the body, and the left hemisphere is in charge of the right side of the body.
So the brain, what we're looking at is basically the tissue as a whole. This brain is covered by the good set of bones that make up the skull. When we take that out, of course, we are looking at the tissue as we would when we isolate or get it out of this enclosement. And so superficially, you notice that there this kind of a crest here. And so the valleys, which are the valleys, these regions right here, those are the sulci or sulcus for one, and the gyra, which is gyrus for one, are these ridges on top. The reason our brain is like that is in this shape, in this morphology. It is because it's maximizing surface area of the cell.
So it crams it in by folding up the tissue, much like you would crumple a piece of paper.
As you know, we have many cells and projections, and so it maximizes the area to contain all those cells. Internally, if we kind of shift our brain, and I think we can take it apart now, in the half, here it is. We have the internal structures, as we see right here, and this is portions of the limbic system and the hippocampus, which are basically managers of function. They kind of relay information from the sensory pathways, and then they have an input on areas of the brain, also the frontal portions of the brain, which kind of make decisions as a decision maker, as you know. But then it consolidates information and it relays to other areas of the brain. For movement, we know that there is also the communication with the cerebellum, and here's a brainstem with all the kind of numbers which depict the sensory nerves or the cranial nerves. Some of them are motor in nature, meaning that they elicit responses. And so the brain is a complex type of tissue. Yeah. It actually takes a full year to understand. Most courses of neurosciences take a full year to learn the neuroanatomy and the applications and the functions and so forth.
One lesson.
Right? But at least you can appreciate the magnitude of how complex is our brain as just what we look at it, look at that tissue. It has so many amazing facts in it.
So both cerebral hemispheres are connected by a thick band of neuron fibers called the corpus callosum. As you can see in the middle, there is a band that acts as a bridge that connects the two hemispheres. And the more connections are, the thicker that band is, and that's called the corpus callosum. Each hemisphere has somewhat different tasks and talents, and this is known as lateralization. However, there's a popular belief that the hemispheres have completely different functions, and that's not exactly true. While there's some specialization, it's not like one side is in charge of art and the other side is in charge of math or something like that, as is popularly believed. I've heard it said that people only use 10% of their brain. Have you heard that? Is that true?
Yes, well, it's not true. For all of you that were believing that might have been the case, maybe I need to maximize my brain capacity. I need to use more of it, perhaps increase it to 20% or 25%. It is not quite true. And the fact is that at a given moment, our brain is integrated in different areas. Again, redundantly, of the brain of the our mass, and the neurons that are distributed everywhere. So it's more like a shift. Imagine this brain like this as a whole, and in this whole brain, different highways of networks of neurons are lining up at a particular moment. For instance, if I want to hold this while I'm talking to you, I'm integrating motor areas of control of the hand, as also the verbal ability, my thinking pathway so I can convey the ideas that I want to convey to you, my visual acuity so that I can perhaps talk to the audience, and many other things. Not to mention my equilibrium, because I'm sitting on a stool, and so I have to be mindful of that, even though my brain kind of shifts attention where it focuses. So all of that lights up different areas of the brain, so that I can say that at a given moment, maybe there's about some couple billion lights, lighting up neurons, and then a little less just at a certain moment, but it's almost all the time constant.
The cortex can be divided into 4 regions for each hemisphere. They mirror each other, obviously. So these regions are the occipital lobe, the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, and the frontal lobe. The occipital lobes is the section of the brain located at the rear and bottom of each cerebral hemisphere, and that contains the visual centers, or the visual cortex, of the brain. And if you think about it, the eyes are on the opposite side of the brain on the front, and the occipital lobe is in the back. So if you might think of it this way, it's like having an eye in the back of your head, except that there's no eye, it's just that's where it's processed. The parietal lobes is a section of the brain located at the top and back of each cerebral hemisphere, which contains centers for touch, taste, and temperature sensations, also known as the somatosensory cortex. It receives information about pressure, pain, touch, and temperature from all over the body. The temporal lobes is the area of the cortex located just behind the temples that contains neurons responsible for the sense of hearing and meaningful speech. It contains the auditory cortex responsible for hearing. So if you think of it this way, it's where the ears are, so it's closer to that. The frontal lobes is the area of the cortex located in the front and top of the brain, and it's responsible for higher mental processes, creative thinking, decision-making, making plans, and taking initiative, as well as the production of fluent speech. It also contains the motor cortex. So that's because you make voluntary control of your muscles. It's a little different from the parietal lobe, which is about balancing and processing the movements of the body. So this is a comparison of a side profile of the cortex, the lobes of the cortex, with a rear view. So as you can see, if you're looking at this from the back, you would see the parietal lobes at the top and the occipital lobes at the very back. And then below the occipital lobes, you have the cerebellum. Okay? And so as we're looking at it from the rear. And remember, each lobe, all the lobes are mirrored for the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. Those are the 2 halves of the brain. Okay, so the cortex also contains association areas. Association areas are found in all of the lobes, but particularly in the frontal lobes. They help make sense of information received from the lower areas of the brain. So these are special units, as we might think of them. In particular, there are the Broca area and the Wernicke area, and they are responsible for different things. The Broca's area is responsible for producing fluent, understandable speech, and the Wernicke's area is responsible for the understanding of language. I'm providing this diagram so that you can draw it out and write down the labels. I recommend this because many people are visual learners, and if you really want to learn where the different areas of the brain are, then it's best to try and draw and diagram it out. So as you can see, this diagram contains the 4 lobes, the frontal, temporal, parietal, and occipital lobes, as well as the association areas. And then you can see the cerebellum on the bottom right. So this brain is pointing to the left. The front of the brain is, or the front of the person is on the left side, and the rear of the person is on the right side. So it's facing to the left. And so just remember that this is a side profile. So hopefully you remember the different parts of the brain. So we've talked about the brain. Let's talk about the peripheral nervous system next. So the nervous system is divided into the central and peripheral nervous systems. The central, of course, containing the brain and the spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system containing everything beyond those. All nerves and neurons that are not contained in the brain and spinal cord, but that run through the body itself, are in the peripheral nervous system. That's why it's the peripheral nervous system, because it's on the peripheral. So the peripheral nervous system can be further divided into the autonomic nervous system and the somatic nervous system. The somatic nervous system is the voluntary system. So the somatic nervous system contains all those functions, all those nerves that control the voluntary movement of the body. So the division of the peripheral nervous system consists of nerves that carry information from the senses to the central nervous system, and from the central nervous system back to the voluntary skeletal muscles of the body. And that's the somatic nervous system. So it contains a loop. The somatic nervous system is composed of sensory neurons and motor neurons. Sensory neurons are also known as afferent neurons as they go toward the central nervous system, and motor neurons are also known as afferent neurons as they go away from the central nervous system. Both of them connect with interneurons or association neurons in the central nervous system. So you look at this diagram, you can see this loop that goes from this, like a sensory sense in the skin, so it goes through the sensory neuron into the central nervous system through a interneuron or association neuron, and back out from the spinal cord out toward the muscle via the motor neuron. So if you think of a simple reflex, like when you are getting your knee tapped, or your knee is going to feel the senses, and it's going to transmit that information via the sensory neuron up into the spinal cord, and it's going to go through that gray matter via the interneuron, and it's going to go back out to through the cell body to sensory neuron, and it's going to travel down the it's going to go back through the motor neuron, I should say. It receives the information through the sensory neuron in the dorsal root ganglion, but it's going to go back out through the motor neuron to the hamstring muscle, and it's going to trigger a kick response. A neuron that carries information from the senses to the central nervous system and is also known as afferent is called a sensory neuron. So remember, sensory neurons go toward the central nervous system. The autonomic nervous system is the system that controls involuntary movement. So as we saw, the somatic nervous system controls voluntary muscle movement and senses, whereas the autonomic nervous system is in charge of involuntary functions in the body. So as we know that the peripheral system is divided into autonomic and somatic, but the autonomic system can also be subdivided. So the autonomic nervous system division of the peripheral nervous system consists of nerves that control all the involuntary muscles, organs, and glands sensory pathways, nerves coming from the sensory organs to the CNS consisting of sensory neurons. So these are all the nerves that can control involuntary muscles, organs, and gland sensory pathways. Okay, so the autonomic nervous system can be further subdivided into two systems that work closely together. And these are the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. What are the difference? I put it up and down arrows so you can kind of see that they work together, but in opposite directions. The sympathetic system is designed to activate the body for action. So it dilates the pupils. If you think about it like in a response to anxiety or stress, these are all the things that activate the body for a response. So it dilates the pupils, inhibits the flow of saliva, and accelerates your heartbeat. It speeds up your breathing, so it's going to dilate your bronchi. It's going to inhibit stomach digestion. It's going to convert glucagon to glucose because it's going to need that sugar. It's going to need the energy. And then there's the secretion of adrenaline. So it's going to get that shot of adrenaline. And it's going to inhibit bladder contraction because if you are on the run, you're not going to want to be having to go to the bathroom. So it's going to inhibit that. On the other hand, the parasympathetic system is relaxing the body. So it stimulates the flow of saliva because these are all the things that your body wants to be able to do when it's relaxed and it's not stressed, when it's not trying to be active and doing stuff. So it's going to be more interested in eating. So you're going to have a flow of saliva. Your heartbeat's going to slow down. Your breathing's going to slow down. You're actually going to have greater digestion because your body can actually focus on, like digestion basically. And it's going to stimulate the release of bile, and you can go to the bathroom. It's going to contract your bladder. So that's the parasympathetic system. And a lot of that is controlled. The sympathetic system is controlled by nerves that run through the chain of sympathetic ganglia. And on the other hand, the parasympathetic system works a lot through the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is an important nerve that runs up and down your body. So the part of the autonomic nervous system that is responsible for reacting to the stressful events and bodily arousal is called the sympathetic nervous system. So one way to think about this is sympathetic means we typically think of sympathy, so that means, oh, it sounds nice. But sympathetic actually means active. So it may be opposite of what you think. All right, so the other complementary part of the ANS is the parasympathetic nervous system. This is responsible for the rest and digest, or the feed and breed activities that occur when the body's at rest, especially after eating, which includes sexual arousal, salivation, tears, urination, digestion, and defecation. So your body, if your sympathetic system is always activated, you're going to have probably some constipation because your digestive system is slowing down. And also you're going to have indigestion too. You might get indigestion, for example, if you're constantly anxious and worried because the sympathetic system is constantly working. You need the parasympathetic system to work so that you can relax, enjoy things, and eat and be able to have sexual arousal and to be able to go to the bathroom easily. So psychoneuroimmunology, just so you know, is a study of the effects of the psychological factors such as stress, emotions, thoughts, and behaviors on the immune system, and is highly affected by the sympathetic and parasympathetic systems. So we'll talk about that more in the next chapter, but something that you will want to be aware of. So let's talk about the next system. The endocrine system is also very important to our mental health, and it's a biological system. We don't typically think about it because it's not it's actually a separate system from our nerves, but is very much connected to it. So one major part that is very connected to the brain is the pituitary gland. And this is known as the master gland because it regulates activities of the endocrine system. It sits just below the hypothalamus, which is a part of the brain. And the pituitary gland controls, so remember the hypothalamus is the one that controls homeostasis. So the pituitary gland is very connected to that, and it controls the levels of salt and water and it secretes the love and trust hormone oxytocin. So it is very much very connected to the hypothalamus's functions, but it is a gland. It produces hormones. So if we look at it here, we can see the pituitary gland is very deep inside the brain. It's very close to the midbrain. Here is a picture of the brain. As we can see it rotating. The pituitary gland is underneath the brain. You can see how it's sticking out. So the pituitary gland is, like I said, it's right underneath the hypothalamus, which is underneath the thalamus. Remember, hypothalamus. The pituitary gland is right under the hypothalamus, and it produces hormones that are very important for the body. The pituitary gland is known as, like I said, it's known as a master gland, and it is also plays a part of our development, especially during puberty as well. Other endocrine glands include the pineal gland, which secretes melatonin. There's the thyroid gland, which controls metabolism by secreting thyroxine. There's the pancreas, which is a major part of the endocrine gland. This controls sugar in the blood by secreting insulin and glucagon. So it helps regulate your body's sugar levels. And again, the brain is connected to the endocrine system because it helps regulate these important functions. It maintains homeostasis. Other endocrine glands include the gonads. These are the ovaries and testes, which regulate sexual growth, activity, and reproduction. And then there's the adrenal glands. These are also very important. These are endocrine glands that are located on top of each kidney that secrete over 30 different hormones that deal with stress and control stress reactions like cortisol, and regulates salt intake and provides a secondary source of sex hormones affecting the sexual changes that occur during adolescence. So again, these are very important, all important to our mental health, because if you're stressed, that's going to release cortisol, which is produced by the endocrine system. Another important system that also is affected to that is also a part of our mental health is our digestive system. People don't realize how important our digestion is to our mental health. It's so important that some people even call it the second brain. The intestines contain more than 100 million nerve cells. Did you know that? That's amazing. It is the largest producer of nerve cells outside of the brain. It is at least 90% of the serotonin, the neurotransmitter that's implicated in mood disorders. 90% of that is manufactured in the digestive tract, not the brain. That's amazing to know. Did you know that? The one neurotransmitter that's responsible for our happiness, most of it is produced in our digestive tract. And that's important to know. And so gut bacteria help produce other neurotransmitters such as dopamine, which are also important for our mental health. Gut bacteria can also mess up the production of neurotransmitters. So if your gut is bad, then it's going to affect your mental health. So mood disorders like anxiety and depression are very common among people who have irritable bowel syndrome. And that's a disorder where people have gut bacteria that is out of balance and where they're constantly experiencing pain. Antibiotics can disturb gut bacteria. because if you think about it, antibiotics literally means goes against your bacteria. And so antibiotics will disturb it will not only destroy bad bacteria, but it will also destroy good bacteria in the gut, which is somewhat bad. And so it can interact. That's why antibiotics can interact with psychiatric medications and influence our mood. So people who are taking psychiatric medications have to be careful when they're taking antibiotics. An imbalance of your gut bacteria is also related to inflammation, and inflammation can also affect your mental health. So people with depression are known to also have a higher level of inflammation. So I know you're an expert in psychoneuroimmunology, right? Mm-hmm. And that's something we talked about in this lesson. Can you just tell us a little more about how is this practical? How is psychoneuroimmunology practical to people's lives?
So in other words, with transitional discussion to this field, yes, I'm a psychoneuroimmunologist by training and my area of investigation. So that's I use an aging model, meaning what happens throughout to the communication between the immune system and the central nervous system in aging. But you asked me about the practicality of psychoneuroimmunology for us. What I can say is that there are three components: the psychology portion, which is the emotion component. That is the word psychoneuroimmunology, but the first part, and it takes into account the emotions elicited or produced by, put out by the brain. Mm. Then that is tightly connected to the network of our neurons. That's what is the neural part, psychoneuro. Right. And so it means that the cytoarchitecture of our brain, how the cells are communicating with each other, have that impact on emotion. But all of that is modulated by this other system, which is everywhere in our body, and that is the neuro, or the immune system rather. Okay. Now, one of the organs that has great amounts of immune cells and neurotransmitters, such as the serotonin that we have in our brains, is our gut. Oh, wow, yeah. So it has been known that the gut is a second brain, and there's a brain axis known as now they call it the brain-gut axis. So that probably you've read, some publications and some literature where they say that when your gut is not working properly, your psychic suffers, can get depressed or anxious. And because there's a connection. So the practical message would be to manage and optimize our immune functioning to the point that we can fend better some stimuli from the outside world. So we're healthy in our gut, and also we are endowing our brain with this good rest so that our immune system can be fortified at night, which happens also during nighttime. Right. Then we can be better off at interacting with other individuals, be able to adjust to changing stimuli, because, let's say that we are confronted by a major crisis and we are better able to withstand that trauma, or it could be maybe other types of stimuli such as infections. And that would make us healthier individuals ready to learn, which we need very much right now, right? We're involved in that activity.
So knowing the role of our digestive tract raises the awareness about the importance of nutrition to our mental health. Studies show that gut bacteria and nutrition can affect anxiety levels, stress, and outlook. So that's why a clean diet is very important for our mental health. A clean diet is high in vegetables and fruits. It's high in unprocessed grains. It contains omega-3, which is found in fish, seafood, and microalgae. And it avoids red meat and dairy, and it avoids sugars and refined foods. That's because red meat, dairy, and sugar and refined foods can have a negative impact on your gut bacteria. As far back as the early 1900s, it was believed that red meat could cause problems with gut bacteria. At the Bethlehem Royal Hospital, George Porter Phillips cured 11 out of 18 patients who were suffering from melancholy simply by feeding them a diet with no meat. It's been found that red meat produces TMAO, a byproduct of gut bacteria. And so if you think about it, if this is producing a byproduct of gut bacteria, then red meat can affect the balance of your bacteria in your intestines. Meat is also known to contain antibiotics. And as we know, antibiotics destroy bacteria in the intestines as well. So there's two ways it's going to affect you. In addition, sugar and refined foods have been linked to effects on mental health. Sugar is linked to increases in depression, increases in anxiety, and it's also potentially addicting. A lot of people have a sugar addiction, and sugar also compromises learning and memory as well in the brain. So if you want to improve your mood, then try cutting, and improve your learning and your memory, try cutting out sugar, or at least reducing it and reducing refined food. What is amazing is that over 100 years prior to the development of nutritional psychiatry, several people started to note that our diet could have an effect on mental health. And Ellen White wrote some very profound statements for her time. I mean, she also said that smoking was bad when other people thought that smoking was good, and she had some other revolutionary statements. But some of those revolutionary statements were about the relationship between our diet and our mental health. And she says some things that seem to be confirmed by modern science. She says that it is possible for one to spoil his spiritual experience by an ill usage of his stomach. She says that God did not withhold meat from the Hebrews in the wilderness simply to show his authority, but for their good, that they might preserve physical and moral strength. He knew that the use of animal food strengthens the animal passions and enfeebles the intellect. And lastly, she said, sugar is not good for the stomach. It causes fermentation, and this clouds the brain and brings peevishness into the disposition. And she wrote some other things we don't have a lot of time for, but it's very interesting to see how she saw the effects of food on our mental health and our spiritual experiences as well. So it's important to get a diet that has a wide variety of fruits and vegetables, and primarily a plant-based diet for your mental health. Research indicates that the best diet for your mental health is a rainbow diet, and that is a diet that has all the colors of the rainbow, because that shows that you're eating fruits and vegetables with a variety of colors. So another important ingredient for your mental health is omega-3. So omega-3 fatty acids comes from deep seawater fish. We want to be careful to avoid those prone to mercury, because that can also have problems. But omega-3 can also come from microalgae. And but the typical diet most people have does not have enough omega-3. So omega-3 is very important for mental health. And so if you want to get a good type, then omega-3 should contain both EPA and DHA. And this has been shown to reduce mood disorders such as depression, inflammation, and it reduces symptoms and delays the onset of schizophrenia. Another thing you might want to also consider is reducing excess calories, because obesity is linked to reduced cognitive functioning in the brain as well. We just want to ask, how does the brain and the biology of the nervous system affect our mental health?
That's a great question. As you know, the neuronal networks in the brain they cause behavior and mental health, or a shift in mental health. So they directly affect or indirectly by how well they work or how poorly they work. So one of the things that we can measure, for instance, is in learning. And that's a clear example, I guess, with great application to our students, since we are in an academic setting. If we have the right connections between neurons within the right pathways, within the pathways of the brain, and they are communicating optimally, and then there's a good balance of neurotransmitters, the elements, we're not deficient in some neuroprotectants or nutrients, then all of that will facilitate the function of the neurons. In other words, how they communicate with each other so that the networks can be established and the learning can be maximized. And you know what? It's interesting that I'm sure that all of us with training, academic training, when we were undergrads, we used certain pathways. As we grew in knowledge, our pathways were being remodeled and strengthened. Yes. Well, strengthened. Some were eliminated because we also had some bad habits. We had to, our brain, we decided that, no, maybe I shouldn't use that type of learning. Maybe this learning works for me best. And so the brain was reshaped. When we got to graduate school, we had to learn more material in a shorter time. And our brain followed us right along. I mean, it remodeled and it maximized the way our dendrites work so they can absorb the information from other neurons. So you have a complete transformation of the neuronal pathways to serve us well, to the point that now you can get in front of a classroom and convey your ideas very fluid and also kind of give your own inputs based on experience and what you've read. And that is a capacity that the brain has to grow through all these years of training, you see.
Right. Okay. So how might we want to take care of our brains to maintain our mental health? What are some things we should probably be careful about?
One of the things we can do is sleep. And our students don't have a habit of sleeping because I think that the more time they put in, they think that by staying up late more time or more hours, that's going to do them, a service. But actually it's the opposite. It so happens that at night there are mechanisms in the brain that purify or detoxify the brain cells from all that the toxins that have been accumulated throughout the day. Remember that there's this is a fact. Our brain is only the mass is only about 2% of the body, yet it consumes 20% of the glucose of all the nutrients we put in. I mean, the fuel.
Right.
Well, that is going to accelerate metabolism and the brain tissue, and that means that there are going to be byproducts that need to be cleaned out at night. And if we don't have the correct amount of hours in which we sleep completely, go through the full cycles of the sleep cycle, the full waves and phases, then we're going to deprive our brain of that function, which is crucial for it to function for us and work for us at the next day.
So let's conclude and let's think about what are some main takeaways we can take out of just understanding the basic structure of the brain.
Well, as a whole, the brain, it's an important part of who we are. And I know the students have heard in your training as well that it directs kind of most of the activities in our body. And it does it by modulating and keeping homeostasis, basically equilibrium throughout the body of both fluid intake and also how much we put out. Temperature, basal core temperature. It does it also by the heartbeat, the heart rate, the ventilation rate. So those are contained in this portion of the brain stem. So it has that functional part of homeostasis maintenance, right? The other portion is the emotional part. And the emotional brain, as we know, is deep inside that, this wonderful mesh right in the middle, right inside, in the deep areas of the brain. And so there's some nuclei there that are facilitators of emotions. In other words, they may help us to make sense of every stimuli, whether it's positive, negative, so that we can survive. Evolutionary biologists like to think of this as the one of the primordial, a very instinctive and kind of important area that help us survive. We know that God has put that portion of the brain so that we can make sense of things. And we are learning creatures. We never stop learning. Even when, we are 80 or 90 years old, we still have something to learn. That's amazing.
Right.
And this points out to the millennium, the promise of God, taking us with him to heaven, which will never stop learning. Can you imagine? That capacity of our brain, and it's a mystery. So,
I think that brings us to the next section, which I'd like to end on, which is the spiritual perspectives on the brain. How can we look at the biology of the brain from a faith perspective?
That's a great question, because it is actually one of the aspects that my wife is a psychiatrist, and we both became involved, and when we tried to present brain health to individuals and what we can do to optimize brain health. It so happens that the set of beliefs that we have when we adopt a faith, and all of us belong to perhaps a community of faith, right? Or most of us. The manner in which we process the ideas about redemption, forgiveness, service, faith, even how we treat people that are subordinates or people that are superiors, and the way we approach the theology of approaching God. Are we approaching him for favors only, or we want to establish a relationship? What the nature of that relationship? The question of good and evil. All those things and many more that are very philosophical in essence can affect how our neurons start to integrate ideas and make us function on a day-to-day basis, on a daily basis. It's amazing. Right. And so spirituality is a huge component that we cannot avoid. Most people says, develop your, most academicians say, develop your mind, learn, and enlighten your mind. Well, part of the enlightenment is to understand where we come from, what is our purpose in life, and where does God fit in all this for us. And so spirituality is a huge component in the manner in which we believe in, the type of God that we believe in is basically reflects and turns around. Our brain processes that information, establish the pathways, we reinforce them with habits, and then we turn around and treat our fellow men in that way, in the manner that we believe God is.
I've seen research that shows that faith and prayer act as like a coping resource that allows the body to be able to handle stress. Would you agree with that?
Yes, but it's only part of it, because the faith component has to be tied to actually an action-based activity. To give you an example, so let's say we're losing money. You have a financial strain. Let's say at home, a lot of us do, and we have, let's say, a disease, and then we have to, spend money because of our child maybe got ill, and we go to God. We kneel and we ask Him, Lord, we need Your help right now. And I want us to, we ask you to show us what is the best way to proceed. So we ask Him for guidance. But that's one component. The other component is actually shaped by our set of beliefs. Some people think that prayer is enough.
So it's not just the act of praying and the coping resource, but you're saying it's also the beliefs that shape the way we think.
Absolutely. So let's say a clear example, let's say whereas you believe in praying, but you have to do something. So you're a decision maker and you start making adjustments coupled with that faith component. That is much more effective than just say, for instance, myself saying, Lord, please help me, and do nothing because God is great, right? And so I just do. And that has to do with a set of beliefs that we created in the beginning. So what we put in our brains comes back and comes out as actions that may hinder us from a solution or may take us there, you see?
That brings to mind some Bible verses for me, especially about how God can transform us and change us. But any specific verses that come to your mind?
There's so many Bible verses, but I think one of my favorites, and perhaps many individuals' favorites, is 1 John 4:18. It says, there's no fear in love, but perfect love casts away fear. In that phrase, basically, there's the principle that the pathways that uphold love are the ones which we should uphold, and they, in turn, will drive away the pathways of fear. In other words, if we are dominated by fear, I don't want to fail, I don't want to,
that is in the amygdala. The amygdala is where the fear is all at, right?
So the amygdala is an area of the brain that relays the communications of fear, the pathways. We have to shrink it, both literally and also functionally. How do we do that? Therapy, support, spiritual component, understanding, but it's a process that we have to engage with the reason. We cannot engage without the reason. In other words, our frontal areas where the executive decision is. In other words, if I know that a type of behavior is affecting me to the point of being dysfunctional for whatever reason, we have to consciously, and therapists do this, right? No, I want you to tell me that, I want you to acknowledge and say that I'm wrong in with this, doing this thing, this behavior. And once that happens, the recovery towards the pathways of love can begin. And the message is, incredible, because we serve a God of love, not a God of fear.
Amen.
Yet many Christians operate under the pathways of fear. And thereby we misunderstand God tremendously. No wonder we have many non-Christians kind of looking at us and say, I don't want to be a Christian if I'm gonna act in such a way.
Well, that's a great reminder. And all of us, no matter what we identify with as Christians or not, we all struggle with these emotions. And if we allow these negative emotions to overwhelm us, then it's going to cause effects on how we relate to people. It's going to affect our own physical health, and it's also going to affect the way we relate to God too, right? And so my hope is that you've gotten a lot out of this, and that you will see how we can take care of our health and our mind, body, and spirit by changing the way we think, as Dr. Perez talked about. And the change in the way we think can have a real impact on our brain, and that has an impact on how we behave and relate to others. So thank you for joining us. Thank you, Dr. Perez, for being with us today. Join us for our next chapter, Just Breathe, on stress and health psychology.